This morning's scripture is taken from Numbers chapter 15, verses 14 through 16, and Matthew chapter 2, verses 13 through 15. Numbers chapter 15, verses 14 through 16. An alien who lives with you or who takes up permanent residence among you and wishes to offer an offering by fire, a pleasing odor to the Lord, shall do as you do. As for the assembly, there shall be both you and the resident alien, a single statue, a perpetual statute throughout your generations. You and the alien shall be alike before the Lord, and you and the alien who resides with you shall have the same law and the same ordinance. Matthew chapter 2, verses 13 through 15. Now after they left, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother by night, and went to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. "Out of Egypt I have called you, my son." This morning's message is by Reverend Don Smith, A Nation Born of Immigrants.
This morning on the Presbyterian calendar is Immigration Sunday. And there's a connection between Immigration Sunday and the July 4th celebration. Because immigration, as we know it today, is filled with people who are looking for freedom, people who are looking for the same rights, the same escape from abuse that our forebears wanted when they struck and began to revolt against England. And so this morning I want to talk about what immigration today means and remind us of some things that are really important. And at a certain point, I will ask Coco to pass out a sheet that I've prepared for you to have some specific information and statistics about immigration from the South. Now, we're talking about immigration from the South because immigration from the North seems to be pretty stable. There aren't as many people who try to come from Canada as they do from South America, Central America, and Mexico. So I want to talk about that a little bit. Some of you, I think, can identify what it means to leave home and strike out to a new place, something completely different, new language, new culture, all kinds of things that are really hard to imagine. The Old Testament speaks of, and throughout the Old Testament, there are they address the idea of being aliens, because in Exodus 22:21 and Exodus 23:9, God specifically says to them, don't abuse or oppress the aliens in your land, because you were aliens in Egypt and you know what it's like to be treated that way. And so you cannot do that to the aliens who live with you. We have the Exodus, which was a wholesale leaving of one way of life and being taken to another place altogether. And God promised them that he would deliver them to a place of milk and honey, but they resisted the whole way. And then finally, later, when Israel is settled and being unfaithful to the covenant they have, God sends them into exile for a generation. And they have to come to a new place, a new language, a new culture altogether. And Jeremiah, in chapter 26 of his book, his scroll actually, he sends them a letter. And he says, God has sent you there. And you need to pray for the people that are there. You need to buy land. You need to sort of settle in and become part of that nation, because God wants you there so that they can learn about Yahweh. And while it's painful and it's a big change in your life, it's part of God's plan for you. And so we're talking about this movement of people from one place to another this morning. Now I want to remind you of Psalm 22. The earth, 24, excuse me, Psalm 24. It begins, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, everything in it, the sea and everything that dwells in that. And if we stop to think about, and this is a radical thought, I know, but all of the boundaries that governments have set are man's boundaries. When God looks at the earth, he sees one planet. There are no boundaries. All of it belongs to him. And every single person is a brother or sister to each other because God is our common Father. And so we have created these boundaries. We have created these places that separate us from another and make us leave one place for another, and we call themselves aliens. Think about the fact that the First Nation, the Native American community in this country, aren't the first ones here. There were Norsemen that came even before that and built mounds, and we don't know exactly what the mounds were for, but we know that there have been other civilizations and other cultures that have been in our land for a long time. I remember a letter that was written by a woman in a place called Bernie, where I lived. And in the letter to the editor, she wrote, I came 2 years ago to Bernie, and Bernie is such a wonderful place. It's a small town. Everybody knows each other. And she said, all the people that are moving in now are going to change it. It's going to be big. It's going to be complicated and all. And as I read that letter, it struck me that I lived in Bernie before she came. I'd been there probably 10 years before she came. And if the rule that she proposed in this letter, because she wanted the water district to stop connecting new houses and so on to keep people from moving in. And it struck me that if I had had the same attitude, she wouldn't have been able to come to Bernie. All of us seem to have this idea that we like things settled and calm and the way we like them. And if other people come in, it's somehow threatening. There was a young man featured on one of the news programs the other day. It was PBS Nightly News. And he was interviewing children. Did any of you? Well, he talked to one little girl, and he said, should people who have differences like each other or speak to each other and so on? And she says, oh, yes. And he says, well, why? And she said, well, if there are differences, we can learn from each other. Now, that's the way God would think. That's what God would tell us. So that when we talk about people who are coming from other places into our life, instead of being afraid, we should look forward to what we can learn from them and what they can teach us. You know, congregations have the same problem. Some congregations are so settled that when new people come into membership, they bring new ideas and they come from a different experience altogether. And it's kind of worrying for congregations sometimes because they may not want to change. They may not want to listen to the new ideas and so on that come in. So as we talk about this, let's keep all those things in mind. Now, I did some study on the immigration from the South. And people from Africa tend to go to Brazil and then come in from Brazil. But most people from Central and South America come up what's called the Pan-American Highway. And as they come, the governments that they pass through, like 5 or 6 countries, leave them alone. They're glad to have them go through and so on. They don't harass them. They don't penalize them. They don't charge them anything. But there's a place called the Darien Gap. Have you heard of that? It's 60 miles long, and it goes through primitive jungle. And it's a very dangerous place. It's kind of interesting. There's no road because it's too dense. And environmentalists resist the development of that 60 miles because it's one of the few places on the face of the earth that is still in its primal form. It's dense. And there are crocodiles there are poisonous snakes there, and there are mosquitoes some of the size of your hand that carry Zika, malaria, yellow fever, and West Nile. And so passing through that is very dangerous. Children come with their parents through the Darien Gap as well. And people get lost there. Sometimes the coyotes will bring them in part way and then they'll leave them and they don't know where to go. They get lost and they die there. Well, then when they get through the Darien Gap and they come on toward our country, they pass through the Sonora Desert. 50 miles of desert. Now, there are groups who worry about the immigrants that are coming through the Sonora Desert, and they'll put water out so that as people come, they will find water and have water to drink so they won't expire. And there are other groups who do not want the immigrants to come, and when they find the water, they pour it out. It's dangerous to make this trip. And the reason I want you to see the danger, I want you to think about what it means, is why would people do it? Why would people put their lives in danger and go through all this to come to the United States? Now, we have an example of our own. In addition to some of you, the New Testament lesson this morning reminds us that the Holy Family took Jesus into Egypt. Why? Because Herod was trying to kill him. And many of the migrants that come from the South are people who are trying to keep their children from having to join gangs or being killed because they won't, or because of all the crime and the murder that's going on in their particular cultures. They're trying to escape that so that they and their children can have a decent life and have a life that is safe, just as the Holy Family did. See, one of the things about Jesus is that Jesus really understands all of the things that we do as human beings, our triumphs and our troubles, the things that we have to face that are difficult and dangerous. He understands all that. He himself was treated as a foreigner in his own time and killed because he stepped out of line. And as his disciples, we need to understand what it means to follow him. You have a description of what the General Assembly, our national body, is talking about today. One of the committees is an immigration committee, and they are presenting recommendations to the General Assembly right now. And there's a list there of all the things that they are recommending to the General Assembly. Now, those are recommendations. The General Assembly can amend. It can approve part of the report and not, but you can sort of watch to see what happens. But this is what our national body is considering. And one of the things it's considering is suggesting that congregations consider being sanctuary congregations. Some congregations take in people who are trying to come to the United States for good reasons, and immigration folks are trying to remove them, and they have sanctuary in the church. Now, this church is kind of small to be a sanctuary church because people could get in here very easily, but There are churches that are really very complicated to find somebody in. But the point is, the church tries to take a stand for justice. And when a church does that, it takes the possibility of being resisted by not just immigration authorities, but by other people in the community. There's a way of being faithful, like Jesus was, that may get a church in trouble with other people. I remember when I was at San Bruno, the church there, the session there, was deciding whether to become a church that welcomed gay people. And there's an organization, in fact, two organizations that you can join if you want to take that particular stance. And I called up the man who was the executive presbyter at that time. And I said to him, is our church going to have any trouble if we take this step? Because they were in the process of calling a new pastor and so on. And I thought, wanted to make sure that the Committee on Ministry wouldn't make it more difficult for them if they took this position. And he said, no. But he says, you might have trouble from other congregations. So that to be faithful is not necessarily safe. Just like being an immigrant is not necessarily safe. And we live in a world where people face great trouble sometimes when they try to seek out for justice. And so I hope that when you think about immigration and the people coming into our country from the South and so on, you'll keep in mind, one, that the earth is the Lord's, and that all the boundaries we have set are not God's boundaries, but human beings' boundaries. And that our own Lord was an immigrant who fled his area because he was in danger, just as many of the migrants who come to our country are fleeing because of the trouble they face in their country.